Welcome to this new school program sponsored by the IRP. We are a community which is held together by our love of learning, in which all the students in the IRP are actually part of the process of developing study groups and learning together. This program is a little bit unusual. It is one of the programs we do each semester, reaching out to our community, and it was made possible by a grant from the family of Stella Tolkien. I invite you to stay with us. I invite you to ask questions later. We will be filming this, so I ask you to do a couple of things. Please, I get the opportunity to do this very infrequently. Please turn off your cell phones and other recording devices. I feel as if I've arrived saying that. And also, please remember that there is a video being made of this. And if you have to go to the men's room or the ladies' room, go along the outside of the room. This program obviously strikes a chord, it gets a response. Many of us are here because of the stories we heard and the experiences we had years ago. I'm very pleased to turn the podium over to the student in the IRP who has been responsible for putting this program together, Gloria Troy.
Good afternoon and welcome to Fridays at 1 and the final program in our spring series. This program is a fun trip down memory lane for me. I grew up in the Bronx and spent lots of time on the Grand Concourse. I used to go to the Paradise Theater to see a movie and sit under a ceiling of stars and clouds that actually moved, and then go directly across the street to Crumb's for a hot fudge sundae. You know. Many of my friends descended the grand staircase, always in silhouette, of course, when they got married at the then luxurious Concourse Plaza Hotel. The Grand Concourse is currently celebrating its 100th birthday, and to mark the occasion, Constance Rosenblum has written a wonderful book, Boulevard of Dreams, Heady Times, Heartbreak and Hope, along the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Constance Rosenblum was the longtime editor of the city section of the New York Times, and from 1990 to 97, she was editor of the paper's Arts and Leisure section. Prior to joining the Times, she was culture editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer and a reporter and editor at the New York Daily News. She has taught courses in cultural and urban affairs reporting at Columbia Journalism School and worked as a writer for the New York City Planning Commission, where she helped draft the city's first master plan. In addition to Boulevard of Dreams, she's the author of Gold Digger, The Outrageous Life and Times of Peggy Hopkins Joyce, a biography of a Jazz Age celebrity published in 2000. She is also the editor of New York Stories, the Best of the City section of the New York Times, published in 2005. A new collection of essays from the City section will be published by NYU Press this September. The New York Society Library has recently chosen Boulevard of Dreams as a winner in the 2009-10 New York City Book Awards. These awards are given annually to books that capture the essence of New York City. Before I introduce Connie, I would like to read a couple of short reviews that were written for her book that I found particularly moving. For anyone who has ever loved a great street or neighborhood, as change after change swept over it, and dreams and challenges converged. So in fact, this is a book for anyone who has ever lived anywhere. It's a rich, sometimes wild ride through a century of history, beautifully written by a gifted observer. And the second review is, like the Grand Concourse itself, Rosenblum's Boulevard of Dreams is stately and elegant, proud and poignant. Building by building, block by block, character by character, she leads us on what is not just a tour of an epic thoroughfare, but of a city, a culture, and an era. People who love New York will devour this bittersweet and beautifully written book. Then they will make a beeline to the Bronx for a spazier along the Concourse, to ponder how spectacular it once was and to savor every bit of what remains. Following the Q&A, we will have our usual coffee and cookies, and you will have the opportunity to buy a copy of Boulevard of Dreams at the table in the rear of the room. We'll have microphones on both sides for your questions. Now please join me in welcoming Connie Rosenblum.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thanks. First of all, thank you all for coming out. I worried a little bit that the book might be too old and nobody would come because it came out in September, and I did some speaking, and I thought that anyone who had any desire to hear me speak has already heard me speak. So I'm very glad that there are others, and I especially thank everyone at the New School, and especially Gloria, with whom I've had 5,000 emails arranging this, and I'm honored to be here. I really am. I sometimes, except when I speak in the Bronx, in which I assume everyone's from the Bronx, but when I've been speaking to people, I sometimes ask for show of hands of how many people here come from the Bronx or have roots in the Bronx. So that's a lot. And how many from the West Bronx? And from the Grand Concourse? Great, that's wonderful. And the East Bronx. Yeah, well, the East Bronx is part of the Bronx. When I talk about the book, the thing that the people invariably ask me first thing, and also when I was writing it, is, did you grow up in the Bronx? Are you from the Bronx? Is that why you want to write the book or wanted to write the book? And I always reluctantly said, no, I'm not. I come from upstate New York. I come from Middletown, New York, and Orange County, which I think will be familiar to some of you, near Route 17, the route to the mountains, Red Apple Rest. And I came to New York after college and stayed here almost entirely. And I think because I wasn't from the Bronx, I found the story of its history over the past 100 or so years especially moving. It wasn't familiar to me, and so everything I learned about it, I learned about it for the first time. And what I was especially struck by and why I wanted to write the book is two things. First of all, you know, the Bronx in recent years, let's face it, has gotten a very bad rap and a bad name, and it's like the punchline to the joke, you know, the Bronx cheer. But the fact is that certainly when you're talking about the Grand Concourse and the West Bronx, it has a very long and illustrious history that I think many people have forgotten or ignored given what's happened to the Bronx in recent years. And that, I wanted to retell that story and kind of reclaim that grandeur for those who had forgotten or those who never knew about it. And also because the area suffered so desperately in the later part of the 20th century, in the 70s and 80s especially. And there were many reasons and many explanations given for what had happened. But I wanted to sort through and see if I could really kind of nail that in a way that didn't come up with easy answers and easy blame and easy attacks, because the Bronx was obviously not the only place that suffered. And to me, the appeal of the Grand Concourse is that in this one beautiful, gorgeous 4.5 mile 11-lane wide street, which celebrated its centennial in November 2009, you had kind of this remarkable way of talking about what happens to American cities and what a place means to people and how they feel when it is in trouble. And so I hope that the book would appeal not only to people who cared about the Bronx, but people who care about where they live. when I was writing the book, I had the fear that it was just going to be about a lot of buildings and that there were going to be no people in it. And I thought this was going to be a very boring book and no one is going to want to read it, and I'm not even sure I want to write it. But one of the things I discovered as I was doing the research is that virtually every chapter of its life, starting with the very beginning, was peopled by a fascinating cast of characters. And each one I came across, I kind of thought, this person could be a book on their own. Maybe I could write that book. And I had to pull myself back. But it was, I felt as if I was living with wonderful and sometimes horrible or scandalous individuals, but all of them larger than life and very colorful. And the one I loved most is the man who envisioned and designed the Grand Concourse, whose name was Louis Reese. This is him at work in the late 19th century. He was a French civil engineer. He came to the United States when he was 17 in late 1860s. He spoke no English. He had planned to have New York be a stop on a trip around the world, and he somehow felt so in love with the Bronx that he stayed here his entire life. This is what he looks like holding one of the drawings of the Grand Concourse when he was in the late 90s, when he was closer to making the plans. He lived in the Bronx. He was a street surveyor. There were very few roads in 19th century Bronx because it was mostly wilderness and little farms and mountainous ridges. All of you who know the Bronx know the three big ridges that cut north-south through the borough. That's why they have the step streets, that go up to some of the roads like the Concourse. And he was in charge of mapping roads for the borough, which was a very important job in those years. And he was familiar with this central ridge in the center of the Bronx. He used to go hunting for rabbit there when he was a young man. And at one point in his career, miraculously, because he wasn't an architect, he wasn't trained as a designer, I think he was just kind of brilliant, he envisioned this big, beautiful, gorgeous highway along that ridge, stretching all the way north to Loew Parkway, and originally south as far as 161st Street, and then eventually it was extended to 139th Street. He pictured it with roads underneath, the underpasses that many of you are familiar with, and it's roadway lined with trees. And of course, this was, you can see what the underpasses would have looked like. And as you can see by the horsemen, this was long before the auto was a gleam in the eye of anyone other than Henry Ford. So those traveling along the boulevard would have been strollers or people on horseback or people in horse-drawn carriages. And separating the various lanes of the highway would have been these leafy trees, so it would have been very cool and pretty and kind of Parisian looking. This is Louis Reese with one of the many maps showing the boulevard. And these maps are still in the borough president's office, and they're there. And you can you can't just walk in, but you can look at it and you can touch them, and it's kind of like holding a holy grail. It's just amazing because these were the maps that he and his fellow architects, fellow urban planners, I guess you called them in the day, made to indicate where the street would go. This is what it looked like when they were building it, which was a 7-year horrible ordeal. Any of you who have lived near a construction site, some of you I'm sure are familiar what it was like to live near the Cross Bronx Expressway back in the day. And it would have been noisy and dusty and confusing, and the people who lived in the little houses along the side had to build little wooden steps down just to get themselves out of their house and off to their day. So it finally, actually go back a little bit, it finally opened on a November day in the year 1909, and it was very anticlimactic. It was horrible weather, and there weren't that many people there, and it was the Bronx, so people didn't make as much fuss about the Bronx as they did about things in Manhattan. And there had been a lot of anticipation and fanfare as to what this road would do for the Bronx, but what I found fascinating is it was a good 10, 15 years, and basically not until the Jerome Avenue subway began its being constructed off to the west, the people really started coming to the Grand Concourse and the streets along the sides. But once they started coming, they came with a vengeance. This is Logan Billingsley, who some of you may be more familiar with his more famous brother, Sherman Billingsley of the Store Club. He was kind of the ne'er-do-well, well, not ne'er-do-well, but ne'er-do-well behaving brother. He was a bootlegger. He was in and out of jail. He killed people. Finally came east. He'd come from Oklahoma. He went straight. And in the 20s, he built one of the most grand and famous apartment houses in the Bronx, the Theodore Roosevelt, eventually known as Roosevelt Gardens, a block-long complex with a huge, beautifully landscaped garden inside, with a marble statue of Theodore Roosevelt and a lion, and it was an exceptional place. And it was the beginning of one after another very, very impressive apartment houses that started marching up the concourse. The even more famous than this was the Lewis Morris. How many here are familiar with the Lewis Morris? Which was at that point, until they built Executive Tower, the tallest building on the Boulevard. From the top floors you could see well into Manhattan. It was where all the doctors lived. Virtually everyone in a certain part of the Bronx, if they went to a doctor, that doctor was on the Grand Concourse. David Halberstam lived there, other famous people, and it was really the pinnacle in many eyes. But of course, the buildings that people are most familiar with along the Grand Concourse are the Art Deco apartment houses, which started being built in the late 20s, stopped briefly during the Depression, but then resumed very quickly in the early 30s. The Depression didn't slow construction down in the Bronx as much as it did in many other parts of the city and the nation. And these buildings, which were very fanciful and very decorative, people sometimes say negative things about Art Deco, that it's not very pretty. It was sort of a form that fell out of favor. But you can, in fact, these days, you can still go to the Bronx and you can see things like, if you picture this in color, this is a mural inside one of the buildings on the Grand Concourse. In terms of the apartments, you can see by this floor plan, they were, by modern day comparisons, they were huge apartments. They famously had sunken living rooms where you walk down a couple of little steps with a little railing, and you're in the living room. And it was a little detail, but people were very enamored of their sunken living rooms. They really felt rich and special, and you sometimes wonder why, because it wasn't such a big deal, but they loved them. And of course, as you can see from the floor plan, the wraparound windows, so you got sun and light from two different directions. And remember, this was an era before air conditioning, and there was, the buildings faced east or west, and there was, literally no apartment on the Grand Concourse that didn't get sun at some point in the day. The facades, there were obviously Art Deco buildings off the Grand Concourse too. This is one on Jerome Avenue, and one of the taller ones. Were kind of simple. They were white brick. You can see the wraparound windows, but inside, they were remarkable for their gorgeous lobbies. If you kind of picture this in gold and orange and green and cobalt, the terrazzo floors and the terrazzo ceilings and the recessed lighting, they were gorgeous then. Many of them remain gorgeous today, even despite all the things that have happened to the Bronx. Here's another example. You can see the inlay. And you can imagine that just walking into these buildings made people who were already very proud of themselves, the upwardly mobile Jews, primarily for whom the Concourse was such a beacon and a real sign that they had made it, this beautiful, long, famous, celebrated street. And then they would come into these buildings and they would feel so good about themselves. And one of the, I won't use the word messages exactly, but one of the themes in the book is that certainly then, and in some respects it continues today, is that living in a certain place can make you feel very good about yourself. And that's, you know, people don't always have reasons to feel good about themselves, but the people who came home through these lobbies really felt as if they were something because they had made it. This is the famous Emery Roth building at 888 Grand Concourse opposite the courthouse that was figured so prominently in Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities many years later. And this is all blue and silver, and it was unusual because it was a concave and convex surfaces. It's still there. Again, you could see the wraparound windows. And this is the facade of what was famously the first Art Deco building in the Bronx, just a couple of blocks off the Concourse on Jerome Avenue. And what you see on the facade is an image of the architect presenting a model of his building, Park Plaza it was called. This is all in very bright crayon colors, presenting it to the Parthenon, because the Parthenon was accepted as the sine qua non of great architecture. And he was saying, we're as good as you, and the people who live here are equally good. You can see the mural showing the sun rising over the Bronx apartment houses, and even today this is here. It's landmarked. It's very these candy bright colors, and this started at 1929, 1930, 1931, and there are 40 official Art Deco buildings along the Boulevard still there, and in the West Bronx there were nearly 300-400. So it really many of them would fall on hard times, but you can see the kind of nautical details like the portholes. These are a little like Mediterranean Art Deco that you see in Miami Beach, where they had smaller buildings, but the ones in the Bronx are much bigger. And again, you picture the colors. And this, of course, is the most famous Art Deco image of Bronx housing, the mosaic in front of what was always known as the Fish Building on the Concourse at 166th Street, opposite the Andrew Friedman home, in very, very bright colors and fish. This is a close-up fish and underwater life. And it arrived in the mid-30s, and it was a building by Horace Ginsburg, who was the leading Art Deco architect of the place and of the period. And people in the Bronx used to say, they always called it the Fish Building, never called it anything else. And they always used to say, there's nothing else like it on the Concourse or in the Bronx or anywhere in the city, and they were probably right about it. And amazingly, it's still there today. How it has survived all the fires and arson and crime and stuff, I have no idea, but I think it just always struck a nerve, and there it is. The Boulevard itself, as kind of the premier street in the Bronx, this is what it looked like in the early 30s. You can see the apartment houses looking south from Loew Parkway, was had a mystique that everybody talked about. When they spoke about, their voices would almost get whispery. The Grand Concourse, the Champs-Élysées of the Bronx, and everybody said it. You can see the famous Concourse Plaza Hotel in the corner, and you can see how wide it was even in these years when the trees were disappearing. It was famous for parades. There were tons of, every occasion there were parades. Veterans Day, Memorial Day, which they used to call Decoration Day, Armistice Day. And during the periods of the wars, honoring the World War I veterans, and then before and during and after World War II, there were always soldiers up and down the Boulevard. And in the early days, Civil War veterans, certainly World War I veterans, they celebrated Bronx Day. Big event in the borough. There were floats with girls, Miss Melrose and Miss Morrisania and Miss Highbridge, and they were all vying to become Miss Grand Concourse or Miss Bronx, and that's died out sadly. This is my favorite picture in the book. It's a picture of, now older than that, a man named Sam Goodman, who was quite young when this picture was taken, in front of the Lorelei Fountain, which was a famous marble concoction of Lorelei, the riverfront siren that came to be put on the Grand Concourse in 1899 and has been there ever since with varying fortunes, as you will see. And Sam Goodman, who's third generation Grand Concourse, and is now in his, I guess, late 50s, I hate to say it, but he grew up there, his mother grew up there, his grandmother lived there, and he left, but he came back, and he now works as an urban planner in the Bronx Borough President's office. And it really, of the many wonderful people I spoke to when I was working on the book, he was the one who, I mean, not only one of the many of the nicest, but he was the one whose story moved me the most because in many ways he represented kind of the old Bronx, you know, Jewish, striving, but partly because of his work and partly because of who he is, he had such a passionate understanding of what people unlike himself had suffered and undergone as the borough's fortunes changed. And he very much did not see the story as kind of us and them, which, to be honest, probably not people in this room, but other people did. As if, you know, we owned the Bronx and other people came in and ruined it. And clearly there was a lot of ruining, but, you know, was the story quite that simple? I don't think anyone really believes it is. And Sam was wonderful in being able to articulate the complexities of the tale, which is, I hope, kind of the lesson that people come away with after they read the book, if they read the book. This is Yankee Stadium on opening day. You can see the cars as they looked in 1923. That first game, Babe Ruth hit a home run, and the rest has been history, of course. It was redone in '74 and redone a couple of years ago and gets more and more expensive. But the Yankees were always the winningest team in baseball. And year after year in the 20s, the 30s, and on until, you know, even today, they would win. They would win pennant. They'd win the World Series. They'd have their victory dinners at the Concourse Plaza Hotel. And the players would stay there, and little boys would chase them to get their autographs, and it was, you know, very exciting. People said to see these ball players walk up the hill to the hotel, it was like it's like God's walked among us. You know, you practically expected the red carpet to be unfurled up from, you know, River Avenue up to the Grand Concourse, but people were, you know, it's before we knew about steroids and before we really knew about the salaries and stuff, and ball players were gods, and the idea that you had your local team and that they were so close was really a major aspect of what it was like to live in the Bronx in those years. But the hotel was notable for many other, it was the most luxurious hotel in the Bronx. It was the site of much political activity, political dinners and events, and the judges from the courthouse across the street, the lawyers hung out here. The Democratic Party ruled because Democrats was pretty much all you had in the Bronx in those years, pretty much the same now, I think. And famous especially for the events, the bar mitzvahs. Everyone in the Bronx knew a boy who had been bar mitzvahed, and the party was at the Grand Concourse. And certainly weddings. The most wonderful wedding you could have was in one of the ballrooms of the Grand Concourse. This was a couple I met. They weren't this age when I met them, but they were Greek. And her father was a florist on East Kingsbridge Road. Her name was Kanganis because in those days many florists were Greeks. Probably all the florists were Greeks. And they were married at the Grand Concourse. And the flowers were gorgeous. And it was probably the high point in her life. And there was no mother in the Bronx who did not wish not only that her daughter would be married, but that she would have her wedding here. Among the many fascinating characters, and some of whom, as I said, were kind of scoundrel-like, was Andrew Friedman. Some of you will remember his name because of the Andrew Friedman home on the Boulevard south of 166th Street, which is modeled after the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. and opened in 1923, this big, beautiful marble building with a sloping lawn in front. The person whose work it was, Andrew Friedman, who was a 19th century, late 19th century businessman, fabulously wealthy, never married, no children, an odd career that had probably more questions than answers, famously curmudgeonly. And the most interesting thing about him is he felt that the people in this world who were most deserving were not the poor, although God knows there were many of them in New York at that time, but the formerly rich, people who had been rich and then sadly had fallen on hard times and were no longer rich. And he thought it was worse to be poor if you had been rich than if you had always been poor, because you didn't know the difference. And so he set out to make a place for these unfortunates. And he created the Andrew Friedman Home, which was home to 100 or 150 people who had to be admitted and could live there basically rent-free and live in luxury and be treated to gourmet meals and fabulous settings and sit in a gorgeous drawing room and look out from these beautiful double-height windows and have all the comforts of home, even though they were no longer rich. He was, I mean, some of the people, as I say in the book, you know, I loved and wish I could have known, like Louis Reese, and he I kind of wished I had known, but not too well. I think that's the, that's what I would say about him. But another person who I became very attached to, and I was lucky enough to find some of his descendants, was a man named John Eberson, who was the man who designed Loew's Paradise, which you all know. This is what he looked like. He was an Hungarian emigre. He again came to the United States. He started out building opera houses in the Midwest. They used to call him Opera House John. And he moved to designing movie theaters, what were called atmospherics, which were, as all of you who know Loew's Paradise, which were buildings, in this case 4,000 seats, very large, that were really palaces, picture palaces, and ornate and suggesting the architecture and drama of Europe, in this case an Italian Baroque garden. And the most remarkable aspect of this theater and his other atmospherics were in the auditorium, a round domed ceiling that when the movie, right before the movie was going to start, it became dark blue, and you would see clouds drifting in this orb, and you would see little stars twinkling, and your jaw would drop every time, I think. And as I discovered, there were special effects machines that could produce these effects. You could buy something that gave you the stars and the clouds and turn the crank and operate it. But nobody had any idea that that's how it worked, and nobody cared. The fact is, it didn't even matter, people said, what movie you went to see in Loew's Paradise. This is what the facade looked even later. Some of you will remember the clock that was on the front, the Seth Thomas clock with the statue of St. George that slew the dragon every hour, and the dragon breathed fire because there was a red light bulb in his mouth. You know, who knew? And this is what the lobby looked like. And if you can picture this, it's been restored, except for the clouds and the stars and the live goldfish that swam in the marble fountain near the candy counter. They are long gone. They're no longer with us. But it was restored recently. It's now not so public a place. It's used for Latin music concerts and boxing events. But it's possible to get into it if you're at one of these events. And I went a few years ago on a tour of the building when it was getting ready to be opened, and there were people there who had gone to movies there back in the day, and they were speechless. They were just beyond tears. You could just see their youth unspooling in their minds, and people who hadn't seen it had the same effect. It was just like walking into a dream. It was really, really remarkable. One of the people, again, who I loved and happily still alive, who guided me on my journey through Loew's Paradise is this then young man whose name was Gerald McQueen. This is him when he was 15. He was an usher at Loewy's Paradise. He was the chief usher. You can see by the gold braid on his shoulder, and he ended up doing very well for himself. He's now executive director of the Javits Center. He became a very high-level cop in the New York City Police Department, and then they figured, having done that, he could probably run the Javits Center, which has had its problems. But it was quite an honor to be any sort of an usher in those years, the 50s, and certainly to be the chief usher. The story of the Grand Concourse is generally told through the white, middle-class, Jewish, upwardly mobile strivers who came to the Boulevard and the side streets, and secondarily through members of other white ethnic groups. There were Irish around in Highbridge, around Fordham University, of course. There was a very small Italian community up near Villa Avenue on the very northwest tip of the Boulevard, where in the 40s, a young boy said he saw the Virgin Mary. I don't know if this is a story you remember. And there were crowds of tens of thousands of people from all over the country coming to visit this hallowed spot where he had or had not seen the Virgin. But one of the stories that's far less told is the presence of minority members, minority families who lived near the Grand Concourse, who were part of what one black journalist in the 1930s christened the Bronx slave market. This is a picture, and this is another. They weren't slaves. I hasten to point that out. What they were is black women who lived in Harlem mostly and walked up to street corners in the Bronx, and this happened in other parts of the city, and waited for day employment, much like the day workers you see in parts of the city and the suburbs today. And most of the people who employed them were the mistresses of these large, beautiful Art Deco apartments in the Grand Concourse. And it was during the 30s when anyone was glad to have a job, however little it paid. But the life for these women was very difficult. They walked miles to and from the jobs. It was, before the Swiffer and the washing machine and drip dry. And for whoever did housework, it was very taxing and demanding work, and they scrubbed floors by hand and washed and dried clothes by hand and washed windows by hand, which was not an easy task. And they were paid very little and sometimes paid much less than they should have been. And their story was exposed by a remarkable black journalist named Marvell Cook, who wrote about it in the 30s and wrote about it again and again and again, and brought it to public attention. And eventually, as the economy improved and as the world changed, their situation changed, and household work became regulated by the government. There were city employment bureaus set up under LaGuardia. But theirs is a very hidden chapter of life on and near the Grand Concourse, and one that existed near the shadows. And as much as I wanted to be able to talk about the good and happy memories that people had about this part of the city, I wanted to include in this story the fact that it was also a very segregated world, as was much of the rest of the city and much of the rest of the North, even the North. And it was complicated. And whether the situation of these women has something to be said when you look at what became of the area is an open question that I leave open in the book, but one I hope people will think about. This wonderful world started changing after the war in the 50s, faster and faster in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. The population changed. It was poorer. It was less stable. It was more ethnically mixed, which is not what made it bad, but made it bad in the eyes of many of the people who lived on and near the concourse. The the city was struggling in untold ways. It was increasingly hard to be poor, to have a job, to raise a family, to get your children well educated, to get health at a city hospital. The blackout of 1977, which was when the beautiful Lorelei statue, as you can see, was so defaced, didn't help. There was arson, buildings were abandoned, less so on the Grand Concourse because they were so big and sturdy and beautiful, but on either side there were buildings that were gutted, became shells of themselves. The crime, the drugs, everybody was affected. White families left, minority families moved in, building services declined. The city didn't help, the state, the federal government, private agencies, banks, insurance companies. No one was really fighting for or caring about this population in those years. In the Bronx, in other parts of New York, in other cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. It was an awful time. And the reasons for what happened are many, and they're complicated, and they're still being sorted out. Many people point to Co-op City. This was how it looked in the happy moment right before they started building it. You can see a very, very young Nelson Rockefeller there, and an even younger Herman Badillo, and a not so young Robert Moses, I guess. And some people blame Co-op City as draining all the white families from the Grand Concourse. Didn't help. The Cross Bronx Expressway, which sliced through this part of the Bronx in the 50s and 60s, also is pointed to as the villain, and again, it was devastating for the neighborhoods in its past. A lot of people blame the New York Times, and they point articles that were written about the racial and other changes in the area. A lot of people, when I speak at events like this, someone invariably stands up and says, "What about rent control?" And I say, well, another thing that maybe didn't help. The fact is, it was very complicated. The city and the nation was changing in very profound ways in these years, and you wonder if there's anything that would have had the Bronx not struggle. I think not, but I'm happy the book came out when it did, because it was possible to end it kind of on an up note, and to be able to say that for all that this part of the Bronx suffered, that in recent years, for the first time in a long time, families, white, black, Latino, Asian, and significantly white, are moving back to the Grand Concourse, to these beautiful Art Deco buildings, which are gorgeous and sturdy, and eager to raise families there, although it's hard because the schools are not the wonderful schools that they were. And, it's no longer a Jewish enclave. The Jews that populated all the synagogues and temples that have now been retrofitted as Jehovah's Witnesses or Pentecostal churches. But it's a place that people are increasingly proud to say they've come from. And I think that had there not been the recession, this process might have been happening a little faster. But as I was writing quickly, the recession was going even more fast, and I kept wondering if it was such a happy ending. But I really think that that the Grand Concourse is looking at its second century in a more upbeat mood than one might have predicted 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And I hope that the interest in the Boulevard and in the area continues to fuel it, and that its glory days are in one form or another repeated in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Questions now, please wait for the microphones.
Ms. Rosenblum, a two-part question. First of all, when the concourse was built 100 years ago and opened for a residency, was there any presumption that, as in some other elegant and fashionable parts of New York City, that the residency would be restricted and exclusive, no Jews, Catholics, or blacks, or wasn't there such a presumption? And secondly, what is the ethnic makeup now of the Grand Concourse, would you say?
The question is, when it started, was there any thought that it would be restricted in any way? And the second part is, what's the makeup now? There was no thought. I think they were just, thrilled when people came, because it kind of took a while for these buildings to arrive and for them to be populated. And it was, different ethnic groups moved to different parts of the city, but the Bronx, all of you who know the jazz singer and Al Jolson's famous lines to his mother, when we're rich, we'll go up to the Bronx, and all the, all the people, the Goldbergs, the Gutenbergs, a whole lot of Bergs up there. And it was always, any novel you read about, 20th century, mid-20th century novel about upwardly mobile Jews, the Bronx, and specifically the Grand Concourse, this was their mecca. You read Doctorow, you read Avery Corman. This was where they wanted to be, and it was very significant that they got to be there. And the fact is, other parts of the city were not necessarily open to Jews. It was hard for Jews, if not impossible, to live on Park Avenue, which was better. So they were very lucky to be on the Grand Concourse. And in terms of who lives there now, it's all sorts of people. There are white families, there's Latino families, there are many West Africans, there are Asians, black families, and I'd say fewer families with children, because the schooling is still an issue. There are gay couples. There are people who grew up in the Bronx and have come back. So it's all sorts of people. And if you look at the real estate ads in a place like the New York Times, you see, except for the recession, you see the prices, especially for a lot of these Art Deco buildings, which have become co-ops, creeping up and up and up. So the answer is very mixed.
Over here.
You were talking about the literature that and the way in which the Bronx was portrayed. Did you come across Arthur Kober and
Yes.
Thunder Over the Bronx?
Yeah, the literature of the Bronx, and did I come across Arthur Kober? Yes, he is. I wish he were still with us. He was one of a number of interesting people who wrote very interestingly about this part of the city. He wrote primarily, or a lot, he did a lot of things, but he wrote many essays for The New Yorker about the Gross family and the famous Bella Gross, who was their unmarried daughter, sadly. And a wonderful story that focuses on the Grand Concourse was called the Man on the Bus, or the Man on the, not uptown bus, downtown bus. She meets a man on the double-decker bus going up the concourse, and she worries that he's fresh, but then he turns out to be okay. But it's very significant that this romantic encounter takes place on a bus going up the concourse. And he's a wonderful observer of Bronx life. Lots of people criticized him because he kind of made fun of Bronx dialect. His characters, working class, spoke in this very thick, kind of spongy Bronx dialogue. But he came from the Bronx. He himself was not terribly educated, although he was briefly married to Lillian Hillman. And to reread his stories really gives you an insight into life, not so much on the Grand Concourse, but on the life off the Grand Concourse. So he's someone I recommend. Doctorow and World's Fair, Avery Corman, The Old Neighborhood. There's Jerome Charon, who lived in the East Bronx, has written eloquently about the West Bronx. So there are like bits and pieces out there.
Over there.
Hi. I was probably on the same pre-reopening tour that you were of the Paradise, and it is spectacular. In your investigations, did you come across at all the reasons why the city has dithered so long in designating the Concourse an historic district?
Yes, I did. And it's a very good question. Why is the city dithered so long? That's a good word. In designating the Grand Concourse an historic district. I think there are a couple of reasons. I think a main reason, and this for example, would not apply to a place like Brooklyn Heights where I live, or the Village, or many, many neighborhoods. The constituency, the wants, the designation is not the constituency that lives there now. And it would be easier if it was, because it would be, my building is gorgeous and I will fight for its landmarking. A lot of the people who would fight for the landmarking live thousands of miles away, and they're not always thinking about the Bronx. The other thing that makes it a lot harder than a tightly conceived place like Greenwich Village or Brooklyn Heights, for that matter, is that the buildings are very spread out. They're like a smile with lots of missing teeth. It's 4.5-mile long boulevard, and there are indeed 40 Art Deco buildings on it, but they're widely spaced. And some other buildings, like the courthouse and Loews and the Andrew Friedman home, are, I think, the post office with the famous Ben Shawn murals. They need to be mentioned. They're individually landmarked, and it is a state historic area, so that's something, although it doesn't provide much protection or attention. But it's I was surprised that even though there are some 300 to 400 Art Deco buildings in the West Bronx, that there's so few on the Concourse proper. And I think the fact also that, unlike federal-style architecture or, elaborate Beaux-Arts, that Art Deco fell very, very much out of favor for many years, partly because of what happened to the Bronx. And for all these reasons, there hasn't been the will, as much as anything, to get the area landmarked. And plus, it's a lot harder to be landmarked these days than it was 30 years ago.
Can you tell me, please, when the subway was put in along the Concourse, and was there any political activity regarding that subway?
Yes, the IND line, 1933, they had to, after just having built the street, they had to rip up the center, and the trees that had been planted and were so beautiful or the ones in the middle, were transported to Pelham Bay Park, but at least they had a subway. But really the more significant subway was the Jerome Avenue line, which came, it was completed in 1917-18, and that was really the engine that spurred the great amounts of construction on and near the Grand Concourse.
I want to point out that there was a very clear line between the East Bronx and the West Bronx. The East Bronx had mostly working class people, and the Concourse meant rich, like Park Avenue. Where I lived, no one aspired to live there. These were all garment workers union people, furriers, working class people. No one I knew ever had a wedding in the Concourse Plaza. This was so above that they just didn't aspire to that. It was a work, they were happy to earn a living, educate their children, and have a family life. I lived in a Jewish section, we called it a Jewish ghetto, surrounded by an Italian section, and they were all working class people. So it's very clear that the Concourse really meant rich, not just, it was Park Avenue.
Yeah.
And also, what I want to point out is when it deteriorated, the people that moved to Co-op City were not the rich. That's why it was ethnically diverse. Those were the working class people when all of the Bronx became, the East Bronx started to be called the South Bronx. So they all were on the run. They moved to Co-op City. The rich never did that. I don't know where they went, but maybe they finally got to Park Avenue. They went to Manhattan.
Well, the issue is the West Bronx versus the East Bronx and the rich versus the poor. The one thing I should say that I found fascinating, because when I went into the research, I thought, yeah, if you lived on the Grand Concourse, you were really rich. You weren't as rich as if you lived on Park Avenue or maybe even West End or certainly Central Park West. You were definitely upper middle class. You were comfortable. You were solid. You were doing well, but you weren't as rich as some. And in terms of, I mean, what you say about what was called the East Bronx is now the South Bronx. The divide between the East Bronx and the West Bronx is fascinating. And the fact is, many people who lived in the East Bronx, they would have been lucky in their own mind, if they could have moved anywhere in the West Bronx, you know, the whole idea, you know, near the Grand Concourse, I'm 5 blocks from the Grand Concourse, that was a very honorable thing to say. You didn't have to be on it, you just had to be within kind of spitting distance. And one wonderful story, I'm not sure I even ended up having room for it in the book, but in Irving Howe's memoirs, he grew up in the East Bronx and writes very eloquently, you know, the politicized 30s about what that was like. And he talks about, of course, the apartments were tiny and you were young and your parents were there and what kind of a life could you have. He talks about on the hot nights in the Depression of walking west, walking to the Grand Concourse, and it was prettier and it was cooler, and he'd be with his friends and you could have a semblance of a life, and then you would come back to your old life. And that, to me, encapsulated what the Concourse meant for someone whose life was very far away from it, in a way far more than someone who was part of that life and maybe didn't recognize its charm so powerfully.
You make me feel that I should hide. I grew up on the Concourse. Diagonally, I have a focal problem. Diagonally opposite the Lewis Morris and the Lewis Minoff. And Lewis Minoff is where I lived, on Mount Eden and the Concourse. And I just wanted to say, my father made the first map of the Bronx.
Wow.
Which
Her
I have
father
at
made
home.
the first map of the Bronx. That's a great achievement.
Which I have at home. I have to bring it to
That's
my
great. Save it.
But I was kind of surprised that you didn't mention Poe Park.
Oh, yes, I always leave something out. Post, Joyce Kilmer Park, of course, where the Lorelei statue was. Franz Siegel Park, which was south of the courthouse and kind of scary because it was high and wooded and weird things happened. But definitely Poe Park. Poe Cottage was on the Grand Concourse, and it sat in Poe Park, northern part of the Concourse. And they used to have band concerts there in the evening that people have very fond memories of. And people, even though the Bronx has very big parks, like Van Cortlandt, and even though Poe Park was a little park, it was very, very dear to many. And every school child in the Bronx was taken to Poe Cottage, and they learned the story of his young teenage wife who died there, and Poe wrote there, and were, you know, they didn't tell the children that Poe drank because they didn't want them, to be corrupted, but he did. But the house remains. They restore it every so often, and it's really a very moving tribute. I realize I also did not mention Crumb's or John's or Addie Valens, and I also didn't mention the Ascot, which is where... And the Dollar Savings Bank. Well, you know, you could go on forever. Yeah, the Dollar Savings Bank near Fordham Road with the mottos to thrift. But the Ascot is where one of the first art houses in the city, and it's where anyone in the Bronx who aspired to sing serious films, foreign films, that's where they went, you know, day after day. It was it was Loew's and it was Ascot. Yes.
A couple of comments.
Yeah.
One, you say Loewy's Paradise.
Yeah.
All us kids said Loewy's Paradise.
Yeah.
But we were corrected by our teachers and by our careful parents. It's Lowe's Paradise.
Well, is it Lowe?
But that gives you the Bronx flavor, so please continue.
Yeah, well, I'll just repeat the question. Is it Loewy's or Lowe's? And the fact is, then it was Loewy's, it's become Lowe's, but in my book, it's Loewy's, so.
In our book, it was
Good.
always
Okay,
Loewy's.
good, great, yes.
Then there are the area around the Concourse had roots, and it held people together. And as somebody commented, there was a large Jewish population, but there was also an Italian and Irish population that was quite prominent. For those who may be interested, there are a group of us who have reconnected and meet. We lived around the Tremont, the 175th to 165th area. We went to Wade Junior High School, PS 28, and then some of us went to Taft High School, others to Bronx High School of Science. We still meet. So if anybody is interested, I'll give you a phone
Okay,
number
this
where
is
they can
someone
get
who
in
can
touch
help.
with us.
people connect, yes.
Hello. Yeah, hi, over here. Here it is.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there neighborhood associations now or groups that have appeared to stabilize, to renovate at least their own block, their own building, take over a park to help restore that?
The question is, are there neighborhood groups that have taken over parts of the area to help restore them? Yes. One of the things that helped the Bronx come back, if you will, in the late 80s and the 90s was a lot of community-based organizations that were instrumental in reclaiming buildings, getting them renovated, getting them, very often with government help, getting them occupied again. Very grassroots organizations, community groups. It was really that, as much as anything, or more than anything, that has helped the Bronx rebound. So the answer is yes, it's a lot harder to do given the current economy, but there's been a lot of, both in the West Bronx and in other parts of the borough, a lot of grassroots activity, some of it religiously inspired, that has really profoundly affected this part of the city.
Anyone else?
I was wondering, were there any townhouses? Because I remember I must have been no more than 3, and my aunt and uncle lived up there. And we came for a Jewish holiday from Manhattan, and they had to put me on telephone books so I could reach the tabletop. And I'm just wondering, I know they lived in a townhouse, and I know they called it the Grand Concourse. Were there townhouses adjacent, or?
The question is, were there townhouses on the Grand Concourse? There may have been a few, but the main housing form on the Concourse, as time went on, there were some single-family frame houses, some smaller houses, but increasingly it was 6-story apartment, 5- and 6-story apartment houses. The better ones had elevators, and they looked very much alike. And this really was the, there are always few exceptions, but this was the main housing type.
Was the Grand Concourse strictly that boulevard, or were people who lived in a townhouse, let's say behind the building, still considered themselves living on the Grand Concourse?
I mean, if you didn't live on the Grand Concourse, would you say you did? I think sometimes people did. I think that, might even be if you went through an alley and your address might have been on it. But people brag so much about being, right near the Grand Concourse, that they said that part so quickly, it always like, I'm, right near the Grand Concourse. So that was the part of the comment that people would remember.
Can you tell us something about the Irish?
Yes, the Irish, second to the Jews, who were the main residents of this area, but there was a very strong Irish population, certainly around Fordham University, around Fordham Road, which was founded in the 19th century. I don't remember the exact date, but the premier Irish Catholic college. And there were many Irish who lived in the area. There were many Irish who lived in High Bridge, which was the very hilly area west of the Grand Concourse. There's a beautiful memoir by a woman named Maureen Waters called Crossing High Bridge, about growing up Irish and the presence of the churches and the bells and the nuns and the no fish on Friday, of what it was like to be Catholic. Also, there were a lot of Catholic schools in the area, and this was an era when, if you were Catholic, you went to Catholic school, and likely Catholic college, but St. Philip Neri and on and on, for girls and boys, up and down the Grand Concourse. And if you were Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic, this is where you went, and you would identify yourself by the parish, which is how Catholics did in New York, and in a way still do these days. So that was powerful, and what ethnic strife there was on the Grand Concourse in this area was not between whites and blacks, but it was between Jewish kids and Irish kids, and the Irish kids said to the Jewish kids, "You killed Christ," and Jewish kids said, "No, I did not." And everyone would go home with, bloody knees and black eyes, and then they'd do it again. So you felt very much a part of your own little world, your own little neighborhood, your own block, your street. You didn't travel as far out as you do today. And the differences between ethnic groups, even white ethnic groups, was far more pronounced than it would be in subsequent times. Yeah. Yeah.
Grand Concourse, there was a Catholic church, and a number of the white live-in maids.
That's not surprising,
And they
yeah.
used to go there,
Yeah.
and occasionally they would have to take the children, the parents would be sleeping.
Yeah,
So there
yeah.
were Jewish kids that used to go to that church.
That
You
sounds
mentioned the
possible.
5- and 6-story buildings. The reason for the 5-story building was you didn't need an elevator,
Didn't need didn't need an elevator in the 5-story buildings. And
but
in
you
the
did in the 6.
Well, in the beginning, you didn't need an elevator in the 6-story building. So when the law changed and you did, that was a great boon for people who lived in 6-story buildings.
First, a comment and a question, please.
Yes.
The comment, as a Brooklynite,
Yeah.
I so appreciate what you're doing for the Grand Concourse. I wish you would do something on Eastern Parkway for those of us in Brooklyn.
Well, thank you. I wish I would do something on Eastern Parkway. Well, Eastern Parkway is fascinating because not only was it, along with Ocean Parkway, one of the two Olmsted-Vaux beautiful Parkway boulevards in Brooklyn, but in many respects, they both served the function that the Grand Concourse served, in terms of being a magnet for upwardly mobile Jews who wanted to move out of the Lower East Side, and bump by bump, they would make their way to a place like Eastern Parkway, which is, has many gorgeous spaces.
My question has to do with the Bronx YMYWHA.
Yeah.
I was placed at the original Bronx Y, which was on Fulton Street, across the street from Crotona Park in 1951 as a young social worker, and was there for the major battle that took place when the Y moved to the Grand Concourse. There was all kinds of community agitation that this institution was leaving the East Bronx to go to the West Bronx. Now that the concourse has changed so markedly, is it still there?
Well,
And what has replaced?
that's a question. I sometimes get questions I don't know the answer for, and what's happened to that building is one of them. But one of the things I should say, that the whole issue of things moving from the East Bronx to the West Bronx, one of the most famous businesses that did was Alexander's, which of course started out in the East Bronx at the hub, 149th Street and 3rd Avenue, and then before you knew it, it was on Fordham Road on the Grand Concourse. And in fact, the Dollar Savings Bank started out in the East Bronx and moved to the West Bronx. And Temple Eighth Israel, the oldest and most famous conservative temple in the Bronx, now in a, well, not there any longer, but in its day in this beautiful marble building, started in a little frame house in the East Bronx. So as the centers of population in the Bronx shifted from the east to west, institutions followed them, and many there are. Yeah. Good. 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 Thank you for coming.